Well, good morning or good afternoon to you all and to our audience. My name is Eline Chivo and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, a think tank based in Brussels and in DC. And today I am speaking to you from Brussels. First of all, thank you for joining us. That's a great idea. This event is being recorded on Zoom, and to all our attendees watching live on YouTube, you can post your questions for our panel by going to slide.do and access the dashboard using the hashtag AI-Cybersec. So today we're discussing how to deepen transatlantic ties in AI and cybersecurity. A little bit of background first to familiarize the audience with the topic in case that's helpful. Criminals and adversaries are continually attacking our computers with viruses and other forms of malware. And AI cyber attacks in particular are becoming a rising security threat, both for everyday people and large government agencies, as well as companies. Now, as AI becomes more widely adopted, these new systems face both traditional cybersecurity challenges and new threats. For example, adversaries can poison the data used to train a machine learning model or subvert the input fed to an automated system to manipulate outcomes. Interesting is to mention some of their motives. Of course, attackers mainly seek to disrupt and sabotage operations, bypass a facial recognition system to obtain non-authorized access, damage a company's reputation, etc. Another motive is that stealing modeling work or data processing by a company is lucrative and cost efficient, because that's typically costly and time consuming. So you can cut corners with that by reselling what you stole. Also, some attackers are attracted by technological challenges and want to gain recognition for compromising the trajectory of an autonomous car, for example. Now, AI algorithms are no different from other software in terms of their vulnerability to cyber attacks. But because AI is increasingly integrated in products such as smart home devices, medical implants, drones, and more, as well as IT systems used in sectors such as healthcare, education, and government, the impact of successful cyber attacks on AI systems could be more devastating than traditional attacks. These potential vulnerabilities pose substantial risks to consumers, and also it's becoming easier for hackers to develop machine algorithm hacking methods, weaponize AI, and use it to boost and expand their attacks on a massive scale. Because of this, cybersecurity agencies obviously need to respond with far more innovative solutions to effectively protect their users' data. Government funding agencies and corporations are supporting a wide range of cybersecurity research projects, and AI techniques in themselves will provide novel methods for detecting and defending against cyber attacks. But given the scale of these challenges, state-led responses will no longer be sufficient, and solutions will require global cooperation to really be effective. And in this respect, transatlantic allies, so the United States, Canada, and the EU, have shared interest in the digital economy and are united by common values. So they could take the lead by collaborating on a joint initiative for better cybersecurity for AI. So today we will discuss the opportunities and the ways in which policymakers could promote these initiatives with four great panelists that I'm lucky to have with me today. Dr. Jose Marie Griffiths, president of Dakota State University, as well as member of the US National Security Council on AI. Jan Havranek, policy advisor for the policy planning unit at the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. Cameron Carey, you're an Anne and Andrew Tisch Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Government Studies at the Brookings Institution, and Florian Pennings, your Cybersecurity Policy Managers for EU Government Affairs at Microsoft. Thank you very much all for making the time. We will get into a flow of conversation through some questions that I will get to ask you, and then we will take a look at some of the participants' questions to direct some of them to you. Now, starting with you, Dr. Griffiths, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about these trends of these cybersecurity attacks on AI systems. What are those trends that you see in the space, but also to what extent do you think that the transatlantic relation, as reflected by governments, policy advisory bodies, and various other actors, to what extent do they already cover cybersecurity risks for AI systems? Sorry, you were on mute.
Thank you. Good question. To some extent, I think that we have very, very strong relationships, transatlantic relationships to deal with cybersecurity generally. Cybersecurity and AI is a little bit behind what we've been doing more generally. I think that from a government perspective, a number of the fairly recent last 2 or 3 years efforts have cited the importance of international cooperation, and particularly obviously with transatlantic allies. I think we've seen our first tendency is to develop relationships and collaboration within the Five Eyes countries. We've had this long-standing information sharing agreement for intelligence sharing and national security. That's the Five Eyes countries are the United States, Canada, Great Britain, I should say the UK, Australia and New Zealand. But it's really not enough. It's now recognized that that's a good place to start, but it's not sufficient, and that the United States needs really to cultivate cooperation among a much broader and deeper network of allies and partners. So governmental, industry related, as well as academic partners. And at the moment, we believe that the US lacks a coherent national security policy framework for security cooperation with allies and partners in artificial intelligence. The National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence has recently issued its first quarter recommendations. I should point that out. It's available on the website, nscai.gov. But there were several recommendations that related to international cooperation. The first one was that we recommend that a national security point of contact for government-wide AI collaboration be established, and we would encourage allied governments to do the same. The second would be to conduct an assessment of the comparative allied strength in AI-related technologies and applications. And then the third recommendation is that based on that assessment, we should convene a multilateral working group for AI collaboration and interoperability and develop a much deeper plan for collaboration. And that plan would include things like research priorities, development objectives, experimentation plans, data sharing agreements, common standards for testing, evaluation, verification and validation of AI-enabled systems, and interoperability standards and requirements for data, algorithms, communication, and sensor sharing. So that's a very strong set of recommendations that builds on other recommendations that have been made over the last 7 years. So I do believe that the recognition of the need for stronger transatlantic cooperation exists, definitely.
Thank you very much, Dr. Griffiths. Cameron, how do you see this topic from your perspective? And maybe to react to what Dr. Griffiths said, do you also feel that although there are good bases to start with, you know, there's definitely more that can be done, and this is really not enough?
Yeah, Eileen, I agree with your premise that, you know, state-led solutions are not effective in this space. And I think there's an opportunity with both AI and cybersecurity and the intersection of both to really develop collaborative institutions and networks, both on a transatlantic basis and I think more broadly among like-minded countries. We have the advantage that both of these area fields are pretty green fields. You know, one of the challenges in the negotiations on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was there were a lot of issues being dealt with, you know, such as you know, medical regulation. That were very advanced and mature regulatory systems. So trying to harmonize those was very difficult. Here, there is an opportunity to harmonize by building together. And I think as the European Union implements the cybersecurity regulation, I think it needs to sort of move from a government-led approach, in the way that ENISA is structured, in the certification group, towards much more integrated integrated structures, and I mean by integrated both government and private sector and civil society, as well as multilateral. So I think there needs to be greater outreach there. I think there are the same opportunities to do that in the development of AI policies. As the European Union moves forward with its white paper process and evaluates what are risk-based applications, high-risk sectors, to do that in collaborative ways, so that we can maximize the opportunities to really scale up collectively in AI. And I think that's got enormous implications for AI development. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you very much. Now turning to you, Jan, from a NATO's perspective. So Cameron just told us, this is quite a green field in terms of regulations, in terms of existing perhaps frameworks, but at the same time, the state-led initiatives may not be effective enough. So, speaking from your perspective as a multilateral alliance, how do you see the way in which the transatlantic collaboration could look like for cybersecurity and AI?
Thank you, Aline, and good morning and afternoon to everybody. I mean, I would just, build on what my predecessors have said. I mean, working together is really the key principle here. And I would say that the allies have been quite successful, not only in cybersecurity and cyber defense, but also recently looking at some of the new emerging technologies, including the AI. So if we want to take a little step back and look at the past 6 years of NATO's adaptation, we have continued to adapt as we have adapted, and that has also included looking at emerging disruptive technologies. Most recently in London, the leaders of the North Atlantic Alliance declared that if NATO is to be future-oriented organization, it needs to look at the new societal trends and technologies. So this is the broader perspective. And obviously since 2016, the allies have bolstered their national critical infrastructures, including their cyber infrastructures, in line with what we have called a cyber defense pledge, in an effort to increase our capacity to defend against threats from cyberspace, including securing our communications. And when it comes to the artificial intelligence, indeed, this is a novel subject for any multilateral international organizations, but we have already taken some steps to better integrate artificial intelligence and other emerging and disruptive technologies into our planning and decision making. It started on the structural level by setting up a new innovation unit, for instance, bolstering our net assessment capacities, etc. So like everybody else, we are adapting on the go, but the point that I wanted to reiterate is that NATO is taking these issues very seriously.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I see everyone agrees that we should work together. I wanted to turn to you, Florian, from the Microsoft perspective. What are some of the elements that should be factored into this discussion? We've talked about the role of various actors, of existing frameworks, also for the EU. And can you comment maybe on again, what Cameron referred to as maybe the lack of effective approaches, and José Marie hinted to that as well. What could explain this this absence or this lack of of the fact that actors are not convincing as state actors to enable cybersecurity and AI?
Interesting question, and again, thanks, Eileen, for inviting us over, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. So first of all, I don't think there's really a lack of that. I think you have to see this as a developing policy field that's relatively new to all of us in that sense, and also if you look at it in the European context, which is the context within I'm working for Microsoft. Obviously, it's a multi-stakeholder approach that we're following here and adopting, where it's about transparency and trust, and we've been very open and vocal about our artificial intelligence technology, but that now needs to tie in with existing cybersecurity policy as well. And that's where it becomes interesting. And I know that organizations like the European Commission and INDISA are doing some great work there. But at the same time, this is a global challenge. So you need to look at this from a global perspective. And then to drill down a little bit on that one, if you look at that from a global perspective, then there are a couple of things that I would like to hint here already, and then we might take that on a little bit further in the discussion. Is look at the education of certain players in this field. Not all policymakers have had the education in artificial intelligence. If you look at cybersecurity threats that you just mentioned, we've got a beautiful framework in the EU laid down in the NIST directive that has ensembled the CSERT network and all kinds of cooperation around that. How many of those great forces are artificial intelligence educated? If we're thinking about the taxonomy of talking about artificial intelligence and threats and cyber threats, we also have a way forward there as well. Are we talking about the same things? Do we understand that the same way? These are discussions that we had 5 to 10 years ago within the information security world as well, before we turned over and we all called it cybersecurity. So those are a little bit of the things there that I think we need to see this as a development process where we need to go together. Obviously, in a transatlantic environment, we can work together on democratic values, but we shouldn't turn our back towards the global impact it has. It's a global investment as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I'd actually like to pick up on what you said about the European Commission's work on that. You mentioned the NIST directive, and we know that EU policymakers have been talking about creating a trusted European data space. Some of us have followed the release of the EU data strategy back in February. But for transatlantic cooperation on AI, do you think we should be thinking more in terms of a transatlantic data space or a global data space?
That's a very good question, and at the same time also a very difficult one. I think that this cooperation needs to be based on democratic values and on a common approach and a common interest. And if you look at it from the topic that we're discussing right now, which is artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, then obviously you can throw this into the discussion, but I don't have that answer for you at this moment. I really think that this is groundwork. We're really developing this as we speak. Because if you just look at it, and I want to throw another piece of legislation at you right now. Look at this, and I'm sorry about this for the rest of the panel and the audience, but you've got this proposal in the European Union. That's the proposal on competence centers and competence building, which identifies a couple of these areas where we should work together and try to increase our competences within an EU context. And one of them is also artificial intelligence. So that's another set where you can see, hey, we can work together there. And how does that really work? How should we do that? And drill down there in identifying the right way forward. I think that we're in that stage, and what you're hinting right now is a very, very relevant discussion, but I don't have an answer for you on that one at the moment.
Does any panelist, would any of you would like to react on the question I've asked you? Perhaps Jan, I think you've raised your hand.
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, on the issue of transatlantic or global data space, I've given it some thought as well, like other panelists, and it is extremely complex. And as I thought about it, I thought of a couple of sort of activities or issues that fall into the data space for any kind of organization, including for my organization, NATO. One is collection of data. The other is communication and transmission of that data. The other is the data analysis, and finally also decision making. This is one of the key issues, also going back to the values that Florian was mentioning. How do we make sure that whatever decisions we take, we do that in an accountable way, because that's quite symptomatic and characteristic for any data space, whether it's global. So how do we even make sure that we are able to navigate through the large volumes of data that is coming to us fast and can potentially be inaccurate, and how do we do that fast and in a transparent way? So like perhaps others, I don't have a clear yes and no answer. I think it's a long way to go, but it's definitely important to think about the contours, if you will, of such a data space, and what the key foundations, the underlying principles would be.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think you can have that discussion about data spaces without sort of taking into account China. China has clearly created a Chinese data space and is clearly intends to maintain that, and to maintain that in ways that I think represent threats to certainly to values in the United States and in Europe and among many like-minded countries. So I think it behooves us to sort of try to head down this road of data spaces, in part for economic and strategic reasons. And one of the great advantages that China has in AI, as Kai-Fu Lee has described it, is in implementation. In having a huge population that generates enormous amounts of data that is widely available on a centralized basis. We're not going to do that in Europe. We're not going to do that in the United States. So, but how do we compete with that? I think developing mechanisms by which data can be shared securely, with respect for privacy and data protection. That is a complicated process, but I think both the EU and US have advantages on that. We've been working on those technologies, on systems of federated learning and homomorphic encryption, and deploying differential privacy to enable the publication of data, the sharing of data in ways that are consistent with our values.
Thank you very much. Actually, these raises a few points, because we know there are initiatives going on, research and working groups deploying activities to define standards, for instance, the AI Security Alliance in the United States. And I wanted to pick Dr. Griffith's brains about some of the most promising approaches that are being developed to govern AI applications. And according to you, what should be the role of these actors? And especially you mentioned this multilateral working group as one of the recommendations. Who should that working group include? Should they, for instance, be developing those mechanisms for data sharing, as Cameron referred to?
I think data sharing is at the core of the potential success of artificial intelligence. Without data, we don't have anything to manipulate. So data are key, and this whole effort to really focus, it's not only key to the success of artificial intelligence, but actually probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have for the future of artificial intelligence, as well, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks. Clearly, if we are going to get involved increasingly in data sharing, standards become important. I think the notion of perhaps piloting data trusts in specific areas as groups begin to work, we've done this already in research and development areas across different disciplines. Some disciplines have been very effective in sharing research data. Other disciplines have been a little bit more cautious about sharing data, and that has raised the question about what do we share? What exactly are we sharing? What information are we sharing? So in addition to standards, I think documentation becomes a critical issue, and I think efforts like the various groups that have already been mentioned is in fact what are the best practices that can be implemented, not just by any one sector or another, but collectively across sectors. So gradually we can learn to build broader and broader data trusts over time. The other thing, though, that I wanted to be very clear about the multilateral group, that really is focused on national security and defense issues, not just general purpose AI. So I had to be very clear for that purpose. So the National Security Commission is focused on national security and defense, and it's particularly focused on federal government application and development of AI, which by necessity, because of the historical evolution of AI, must include collaboration with the private sector and with academic institutions, because that's where much of the development work has occurred. So I do believe that data trusts are going to be important, and I do believe that among allies, the building of data trusts will begin to create a little bit more of a balance with China against China, if you like. But I think we have to do so very, very carefully, because our values are so very different. And China's stated values and China's practices are not consistent with each other. So we would prefer to have a more values-driven, responsible approach to AI development and application to all areas of life and work and defense.
Thank you very much. Jan, I'd like to react. I'd like to get your reaction on this, the elephant in the room that we eventually mentioned, China. How does NATO apprehend this? And when we're talking about shared values, to what extent do allied nations share objective when it comes to cybersecurity and AI? Who represents the European side? Who represents member states? What member states? The EU institutions?
Well, I think these are multiple different questions. It is true that NATO and the European Union have an overlapping membership base, if you will. But at the same time, I mean, both organizations have different missions, different purposes. But I definitely can imagine the inevitability of NATO-EU cooperation on AI data in general. And exactly in the issue that has already been mentioned, the issue of standards. We have seen NATO-EU cooperation on standards in military mobility, for instance. NATO is not a regulatory body like the European Union, but we also have standards that inform our capability development processes, etc. And in the past, we actually worked with the European Union as a NATO organization to share those standards and feed them into whatever processes the European Union was tackling in terms of military mobility. So there are ways to cooperate. And on NATO and China, I mean, you have to differentiate between individual bilateral policies of individual NATO members and NATO allies, and a NATO policy that is agreed upon by all 30 members of the alliance. And again, referring to the London meeting in December 2019, NATO has agreed that China presents an opportunity and a challenge, and will sort of focus and keep monitoring the issue. But as of today, there has not been any sort of NATO-related, NATO-China related activity in that respect. But obviously, we are also looking at the way that China employs its data analytics, the way it approaches multilateral fora, etc. So this is something to be watched in the longer term.
Thank you very much, Jan. I do have a question back to you, Florian, perhaps from again a company's point of view on the attack surface for attacks on AI systems is very different from those that we see in traditional IT systems, and cyber attacks and techniques are particularly powerful when the data used is poorly controlled. How do you think organizations, how are they thinking, and how should they be thinking about protecting these assets, especially when they come from third parties? How can we think about reporting vulnerabilities in data sets?
That's a very good question. First of all, I think this also comes down to the relevance of information sharing, analysis sharing in public-private environments. That's just key to this. That you do share threats at an early stage, you mitigate those threats, you share those best practices. Again, within the European context, you've got the CISA networks, you've got FIRST on a more global level, and there's a lot of cooperation ongoing there already. Then obviously you've got there's a lot of discussion at the moment, and I'm reading this with a great interest about the threat surface is widening, and indeed that's correct. And then artificial intelligence makes that even more complex, also to a certain extent correct. But if you then go back, and I'm coming back a little bit to my earlier point, again, this is a developing a policy field. There's also a developing operational field where there's a lot of existing frameworks at the EU level. There are a lot of existing cooperation models that are not always very visible because they are most of the time within national security environments that are slowly and even more so opening up and give a lot of opportunity to identify potential public-private cooperation opportunities. I think that's one element to my answer. And the other one is ensure that you, and obviously as one of the larger cloud service providers, this is a logical answer, is having artificial intelligence technology embedded in a cloud environment inherently ensures what we always say, a higher level of security to that extent. Now, lastly, and I think that's an interesting part as well, and I'm coming back a little bit to what Cam said before about ENISA and the role that ENISA has on certification. I also think that certification is something we should look into, even though it's at a European Union level, or it is at a European Union level. Us as a global company, that's a beautiful model to be connected to be invited to join. We do that already in one of the other working groups. Because that just allows us to share that information, that expertise that we have from a global level, pour that into a European model, but at the same time contribute to the global security level. And I think that's a little bit in different stages how I see this issue.
I'd like to hear from Cameron your reaction to what Florian mentioned about certification, but also back to another point Florian raised regarding the need to educate policymakers. And the reason why I wanted to share this is because I caught up with one participant ahead of the event who had a comment about our topic today. And what I understood from his point of view was that the way in which policymakers write policies is with a narrative for a format which one way or another has to be implemented into systems. But that there's really a need to educate policymakers on how they shouldn't just put words on paper and make sure they provide guidance and policies that are easy to comply with. And that each AI agent should really have a performance plan to understand what they're trying to do. But he mentioned there's a lack of funding, so it's difficult to implement good practice, and so compliance becomes difficult. So really the point was to say that policymakers may not always be best positioned to provide this type of guidance, but companies don't have a choice. They do have to comply. So some argue there's a need to remove politics from the process to avoid centralization, so as to avoid inefficiencies, lack of compliance, and polarization. So I would be very curious to hear your point of view on that too.
Well, I think your two questions are really two sides of the same coin. And from my standpoint, that is really in technology spaces in particular, AI, cybersecurity, and other technology policy. How do we open up the architecture of public policy making? This is an area that it's complex, as you've alluded to. Those complexities, I think, are hard for lay people to grasp. Sometimes, even hard for highly informed people to get their heads around. So top-down decision making is inevitably going to have blind spots, and you need both. I mean, I think in some respects, when it comes to cybersecurity policy, the sort of largely almost entirely bottoms-up approach in the United States is not enough. We need to do more. I am working on privacy legislation in the US, which would include data security requirements similar to those in GDPR. I think that makes a great deal of sense to have some kind of baseline obligations. But when it comes to the more extensive implementation, when it comes to developing standards, you need a multifaceted decision-making process that includes expertise, that includes business interests, and I think that is fluid and adaptive. One of the difficulties of legislating here is that things move so fast and operate in so many different contexts that it's very difficult to come up with one-size-fits-all solutions. So we need, things that are complex, fine-tunable. I think a standards development approach, like many standards development bodies have, that combine governments with other stakeholders and operate on an iterative basis, I think, is an appropriate way to go.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I'd like to really have your reaction, Dr. Griffiths, on what are your thoughts on the role of these different actors, including standards development organizations, and what really should this transatlantic program could look like to bring all these efforts together efficiently? Mute. We cannot hear you, unfortunately.
Yep,
okay. Sorry about that.
I unmuted it and I must have remuted myself. I apologize. I agree very much with what's been said by Florian and Cameron. Education is very, very important. It is interesting that we are in such a dynamic environment, probably a more dynamic environment that we've ever been in. But the best way that these things evolve is, in fact, from this combination of stakeholder generated and then top-down decision making. I used to call it middle out, top down, bottom up, middle out was the solution for many of the ways we need to proceed. But this whole issue of education is much, much, much bigger. It's not just educating the policymakers. I think as we see more and more organizations, be they governmental or private sector or public sector for that matter, adopting artificial intelligence based systems, people need to have an understanding of the capabilities and the limitations and the potential of these systems, it's going to be very hard otherwise to see ourselves actually making good decisions, wise decisions, appropriate decisions for the communities of users. So I do think an approach that involves many actors and involves people who are focused on considering the ethics of these environments should, or the privacy rights, the rights of ownership, the other kinds of rights that come along with the development of system these days is very important. And the other piece that I wanted to mention is that we're really now in a digital innovation economy. So I think it's also very important that policies and regulations and standards should be such that they encourage innovation, not stifle innovation, because we're now in a very, very different environment of technology development from what happened in the much, much earlier days of technology development. So the idea of fluidity, the idea of adaptiveness become even more important going forward.
Thank you. That's something I'd like to have Florian's reaction on. Many companies struggle with cybersecurity. So what could really help in terms of policies on both sides of the Atlantic, let's say, to really support private sector companies in adopting AI security compliance program?
Good question. I think that comes back to the cooperation models that are already existing. If you just look at the national level, there's within European context, there's a lot of cooperation already in place. Maybe not to everybody's liking, but there are a lot of programs where people can connect to. I know that in the Netherlands, for example, for the whole SME community, there's this program that's called Digital Trust Center, where they can get best practices, best standards. So again, drawing back on, there are a lot of existing models there and instruments. Make most use of that, but that's at the European level. But if you can look at the transatlantic level, that's an excellent topic to. I'm curious what John has to say about that. But from a NATO perspective and the CCDOE, and we've got so many of these excellent organizations out there that might be able to go from an academic perspective a little bit more in a multilateral approach towards company involvement. Think about exercises, think about cyber ranges, think about exploring how far you can go in cybersecurity threat intelligence sharing in an environment that's trustworthy for all parties. I would go along that line.
Well, I think it's great that you're directing a question to Jan, because if I may add, I was actually going to ask you, back to this reference of the middle out that Dr. Griffiths mentioned. Where do you see NATO's role in all this? Could it be an enabler of this middle out? And I think Florian's question more or less things you to further elaborate on that role.
Absolutely. I mean, just to reinforce what the other colleagues have said, I mean, there are multiple opportunities arising for international organizations, including for NATO, and public-private cooperation and formula is an essential must, if you will, in achieving groundbreaking AI solutions or technological solutions. And we do already have mechanisms in place, such as the NATO Industrial Advisory Group, NIAC, that gathers hundreds of companies, but also Science and Technology Organization, which has a robust network of over 5,000, almost 6,000 researchers and scientists who are working on these technological solutions, and many of them are from the private sector. So this is inevitable, and I do agree with Florian that the private sector can help us test new approaches to exercises, new approaches to even decision making, being able to take decisions in a rapidly evolving environments, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say there is one particular formula or a standard that NATO could help set, but it will be, and it should be, in my mind, a part of the broader international sort of a standard setting when it comes to these technologies and when it comes to the conceptual frameworks and values with which we use those technologies.
Thank you. Any last reaction from you all before I turn to the participants' questions? Any point you wanted to raise? No? All right, so let me turn to some of the questions that the participants posted. So one of them is actually interesting. We tend to forget Canada in the transatlantic relation, but it is an important player. One question from a participant is, what are the ways in which Canada can influence EU thinking on AI? We could perhaps add US thinking on AI. I will also add another question, just in case one of you wants to react to both or one of them, please feel free to specify. What is the perspective of international regulators of the US Defense Department's planned cybersecurity maturity model certification program? So it seems like a rather specific question. Who would like to come in on one of those two or both questions?
I could jump in on Canada because I don't know too much deep down into the DoD environment, but the relationship with Canada, between Canada and the United States, is clearly very strong. They're a member of the Five Eyes consortium, and we have a lot of collaboration between the two countries. But I was also impressed with Canada's recent move to work with Germany also on the issues of big data and cybersecurity and AI, the Together into the Future initiative. So I think Canada has a role to play, has always had a role to play. It just is a little bit quieter than the United States or perhaps the European Union. It just goes along quietly and has a lot of capability, and in fact has been developing its own AI capabilities as well as cybersecurity over the recent years. So some of the moves that Canada has made are sort of quite interesting. Structurally, it's a very different country from the United States. The United States with each of the states is a different model, but certainly a tremendous amount of interaction going on between the two of us, but primarily through the Five Eyes consortium.
Yeah, so I think Canada is an interesting case, and I think it has things to teach both the United States and the EU. It's the first national government to establish, a systematic AI strategy, and did that. I think it was about 3 years ago. It put that initiative into place. And interestingly, that initiative, essentially, it outsourced to an outside experts group. So certainly not although the initiative came from the national government, it was not a top-down approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. There was another question about the cybersecurity maturity model certification program. Someone is asking whether there was any resistance on the part of regulators to having multinational corporations participate in that program, and whether they will even adopt it. Would anyone wants to react to? No? All right. Another question was regarding corporate culture variation. So to what extent do you believe that the fact that, I suppose, as the question being asked was this, as it goes, that the fact that enterprises, companies across both sides of the Atlantic may not share corporate values, that might be a barrier to alignment. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hear corporate, so I think I am expected to jump in here. I have to say, until last year, I concluded 12 years of working for public government, so I still bear that with me. Now, a very interesting question there, but I think that especially the situation we're in right now, in the COVID crisis and all the efforts that you see popping up are a clear demonstration of companies taking responsibility. So I also want to look at it from that perspective. You do see that companies are providing they're going further than they've gone before, and also providing, from a cybersecurity perspective, more measures in place, because one of the things that we didn't address before, and I'm going a little bit away from the topic, but I think it's also good to mention, is that we've seen that there's this idea that there are a lot of more attacks at the moment due to COVID. But if you and we've posted on that as well. That's the only commercial I'm doing, by the way. We've posted on that, and what we've said there is, yeah, you do see that it seems to be that there are more attacks now, but actually we just see that they're misusing the situation, or actually they're using the situation for their own purposes by luring people to click on information. That kind of information now is pushed out quite rapidly, and that's one of the examples that I've seen, that we take more responsibility. So in that blockade, and then transatlantic division or global or European doesn't really matter. It's a global common effort, especially now.
Yeah, I get this message of it's important to work together, and everyone has a part to play in all this. I wanted to ask you your thoughts with a final question. Talking a bit more broadly, there's discussion going, about a split between different types of systems, the West versus the rest, or the West versus China. We mentioned China, including for the internet, for tech agendas, and for rules and AI and security. Then potentially too, there are different narratives that are emerging. So perhaps asking your final thoughts about the topic in general, but also, do you think we're headed to bifurcated technology world? What does that mean for AI and cybersecurity? Who would like to start? Dr. Griffith, perhaps.
Myself unmuted. It's hard to say, because I see things at very different levels. Sort of within the United States, I see some potential for bifurcation, although some togetherness at a different level. I mean, I'm looking right now at this urban-rural divide, and in terms of access to technology, and we're seeing it very clearly now that everybody's at home and having to connect. I think we see China and Russia on one side, and the allied nations, the more traditional allied nations, NATO, etc., on the other side. We see the North and the South. We see these divides that come and go over time. So I would hope that we could use technology to overcome those kinds of divides, but I'm also not naive. And I suspect we will always see various forms of division occur. Again, maybe a little bit more fluid in the future than they've been in the past. They're not such hard lines anymore, as things change quite dramatically from one place to another. But geopolitically, I would imagine we'll continue to see certain divides. At the same time, we all operate in our own self-interest to some extent, and so we will reach out across those lines as necessary on specific areas of application and endeavor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Griffith. Yeah. Cameron, maybe a reaction. Sure. How do you see this potential divide? Or
well, there is a divide. I mean, that is the reality of technology and sort of the way that information flows today. But I don't think it is monolithic, and I don't think that we should view that entirely through a sort of national security or a threat prism. But I don't think we can ignore those issues either. I've participated in some dialogues with China on AI development, and I think it's quite striking that at the researcher in the operational level, there is a great desire for collaboration and for the exchange of information, and that is the way that technology is operating. I mean, Microsoft, for one example, does a lot of its AI research, or has historically, in China. But today, some of the tensions in the relationships around both trade issues and perceived security threats are creating more barriers towards that. And as those tensions increase, they feed on themselves. So we are, I think, both sides in a little bit of a dilemma, but we can't defuse those tensions right away. That's a process. So we have to really operate, I think, on two tracks and be aware of the ways that we should be concerned about China, even as we try to change that.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Florian, any last reaction? I think that connects well with Cameron's comments.
Yeah, well, I think that I understand, and from a personal perspective, I think you should also ask yourself, what kind of world do I want to live in? And take it like 10, 15 years from now, where do we want to be? And if you think about those things and you see what's happening now, and I think it was Miko Ibonen from F-Secure a couple of weeks ago in a webinar that said it's completely not cool to attack right now healthcare infrastructure, hospitals, etc. Which yeah, from an emotional point of view, of course, but it just shows what kind of world we're in right now and how easy it still is to see these manifestations come to life, and that for some groups and actors that yeah, the moral compass is different than the democratic values that maybe in a transatlantic environment we share a little bit more, to come back to that topic. Having said that, I think this requires a constant effort, a multilateral effort from academia, from governments, from international organizations, and of course industry. And one of the things that we've fully committed ourselves to is the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace, where we're really trying to push forward the discussion on trust and security by the 9 principles set out in this call, simply because you need to thrive towards a world that you, or drive towards a world that you feel most comfortable in, and you want to constantly work on, where technology just is central in everything we do. So that would be my my input to that very difficult question.
Thank you very much. Jan, the final word for you from NATO's perspective on, it's this sort of potential divide, or, where we move on from there on, that could affect NATO. And I'm thinking also if you could raise a final point or comment on how the US, some would argue, might be taking a back seat when it comes to the alliance. Or would you agree, or would you have something to comment for this?
Well, on the last question, I don't think that's the case. First of all, I'm not really in a position to comment on individual countries' policies, but I've seen over the past couple of years at NATO, US in fact stepping up their efforts when it comes to collective defense, for instance, fight against terrorism, etc. And it is already clear that issues concerning the relationship with China, issues about secure communications, including 5G, are of critical importance to the United States. And the US is indeed working quite closely with the allies to clarify its national strategy and how it sees the situation evolving, which basically leads me to one, I guess, final point about how we think about data in the future. I mean, lots has been said in this panel about education, and I really wanted to iterate that part of the education is also changing our thinking about data and the whole tech industry and the whole technological world. I mean, many countries, China including, are already thinking of data as a strategic, if in fact geopolitical asset. And if West is to succeed in this new geopolitics. I wouldn't want to call it confrontation, but in this new multilateral, technologically driven world, we too here need to start thinking about data as a geopolitical asset, and we need to be able to protect it, to operate with it. So there.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to the four of you for making the time to join and to share your insights, and thank you to our participants for joining us today. The video will be posted on our website in case you have missed some of the discussion, and we will, of course, as usual, publish a recap of the event. Thank you for following us, and I wish you all a great second half of the week, and we'll be looking forward to meeting you, if not in person, soon enough for at least another event. Thank you so much again, and wishing you a great rest of the day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Elaine.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.